The old wooden cabin leaned slightly eastward, as if the great winds of past seasons had worn down one side of its heart. The tin roof was dented and rusted, porch boards curled and splintered with time. At the foot of the stairs, Elias Boone's boots, caked in dried winter mud, lay abandoned, as if someone had kicked them off in haste a year ago and never cared to set them right. On the square wooden table, 2 chipped clay mugs sat, earth-brown, one with a cracked lip. Elias placed them there every morning, a habit buried so deep it seemed carved into his spine. One for him. One for someone who no longer came. No one asked about the second cup anymore, not since Sarah passed, the only soul who ever had rode out of the valley 10 years back, carrying with him the truth of an afternoon fight where no one won. Elias relived that day every time his fingers brushed the cold rim of the cup. Sarah, lying on the sickbed, eyes fixed on the cracked wooden ceiling. He had been there, but hadn't held her hand. His heart, back then, was still full of thorns. Thorns left behind by his son. A boy he'd raised with axe and rifle, with the hardness of western soil, but who chose to leave, to live as an Indian, to join them, to stay with them, to fight for them. In Elias's mind, it was betrayal of the deepest kind. Not just leaving his father, but carrying off half the honor Elias had clawed for his whole life, in wildfires, in stolen fields, in places where the gun was the only thing that kept a man from falling to his knees. This morning the sun had not yet burned through, but the air was dry enough to crack skin open just by moving. Elias lit the stove with a scrap of old paper, faded words barely legible. "We'll talk when I return, Pa." No one returned, and Elias never sent another word. Coffee hissed softly in the blackened kettle. He poured into both cups, drank from his own, left the other untouched. He didn't know if he did it to remember, to keep a promise, or simply because he hadn't learned how to let go. But today, as the morning light slid across the cup, catching the curved crack like a wrinkle on an old man's face, Elias realized he wasn't angry anymore. Not because of anything said, not because he had forgiven, but because anger had quietly withdrawn, like moisture sinking beneath the desert. Maybe his son had done the right thing. Maybe not. Maybe he had simply been a man looking for a place to belong, just as Elias once had, standing among the charred bodies of soldiers on a night the forest wouldn't stop burning. Elias lifted the second cup. For the first time in nearly 10 years, he drank it empty. No one saw. No music played, just the crackle of the stove and a lone crow sweeping past the roofline. He didn't smile, but somewhere deep inside a corner of him softened. And out there, on the porch, a breeze so light it barely stirred the dust brushed across the eaves, like a beginning he hadn't waited for, but was ready to meet. That land sat at the end of a red dirt road, where the map blurred and the drawn lines turned jagged, shaped by the trembling hand of a tired surveyor. No one chose to stay long in a place like that, for it gave nothing but dust, sun, and a silence that scratched at a man's chest like a claw. Elias Boone was different. He stayed not out of hope, but because of a promise that had never found words. On the southern edge of High Hollow Valley, where the grass had yellowed so deep it was no longer separate from the earth, his house gripped the hillside like an old man who refused to kneel. No one planted flowers here, and no one believed the rains would come again. Elias's cattle, 3 of them, no longer had the strength to wander past the low woods. They bit at the brittle grass like it was duty, not desire. One bore a crooked hind leg, bent out left, an injury from the rare flood 2 years past. He hadn't slaughtered it, hadn't sold it, hadn't tried to fix it, just let it be, like he'd let himself be. That morning, Elias woke earlier than usual, only by minutes. but enough to catch the last pale blue hanging low at the horizon, as if someone had forgotten to sweep all the night away. He stood on the porch, hand resting on the split post that had cracked one winter long ago. Before him stretched rusted wire, taut and gray like his own voice when strangers asked for directions. Wind stirred the patch of sagebrush beside the house, the only thing that still grew in soil like this. Its leaves rasped together like the land itself was whispering, "I have nothing left to give you." Every morning Elias checked the well, a habit worn thin with futility. The well had run dry in June. The stone slab covering it had cracked under the sun, and the rope once used to draw water had rotted through. Still, Elias hung the rusted bucket on the branch nearby, as if heaven might take notice, might change its mind. No one witnessed that quiet gesture save a lone red-breasted bird perched on the wire, the only bright thing left in that washed-out landscape. It watched him, then flew off, and Elias didn't call it back. Inside, the floorboards moaned beneath the weight of his boots. In the corner, a tilted photograph. Sarah's hand resting on his, her eyes steady, not knowing that after the shutter clicked, they'd never hold hands again. The frame was dust-covered. No one cleaned it. Elias had once meant to throw it away, but set it back in place, not out of longing, but because he wasn't yet ready to stop remembering. The night before, Elias had drifted to sleep to the sound of wind tapping at the walls. In a dream, a hand touched his shoulder, just the way Sarah used to when he grumbled about cattle breaking the fence while stirring the stove. He woke to emptiness. Only a slant of moonlight fell across the cold kitchen, casting the second cup's shadow long on the wood. Elias stared at it a while, then lifted it, touched his lips to the chipped rim, then set it down again. He didn't drink, didn't spill it, didn't replace it. Some things he wasn't sure he'd forgiven. He only knew vengeance no longer called his name. The nearest town lay 6 hours by horse. Once a month, Elias rode in for salt, beans, medicine, coffee, and a box of bullets he never used. Folks no longer called him Mr. Boone. Now it was just him, the old one out by the valley's end, and that was fine, because Elias no longer needed his name, as long as he still knew who he was. By noon, the heat pressed down like the tongue of fire slipping through the distant ridges. He slammed the barn door shut, fixed the rusted latch, and smoothed the cowhide over the vent. The wind growled, brief and angry, but Elias didn't bow, not because he no longer feared the heavens, but because he had learned how to endure when no one, not even himself, stood with him. And it was on that land, so dry it couldn't even grow sorrow, that something strange was about to happen. There was no thunder, no warning rider, only a first drop of blood that would stain the dust just after sundown. And Elias, for the first time in years, would be forced to choose not with his hands, but with something long asleep behind his ribs. The well on Elias Boone's land had gone dry in June. By August, the bottom held no trace of dampness. By September, even snakes no longer bothered to crawl inside. Each morning, Elias still walked out to it, iron bucket in hand, not hoping for water, but for the sound of metal striking stone, the only echo that ever came back from the earth. A reply, even if it was silence. But this morning, he didn't bring the bucket. He just stood there. His eyes stared down into the square black hole. Once the beating heart of the home, now just a mute mouth that no longer answered. Beside the well, he hung the bucket once more on a leafless branch, as if someone above might be watching and needed a sign to show mercy. No one asked why he did that every morning, and if they had, Elias would have had no answer. Old faith, like the rusted pail, still held its shape, but couldn't hold anything anymore. Back inside, he set the coffee pot on the wood-burning stove. The cedar log smoldered with a scent Sarah used to love. "Smells like your shoulder after a day in the woods," she once said. Now only warm smoke and the kettle's low whistle remained. Elias poured the coffee into 2 cups, his own and the other one. The second cup, he didn't look at it anymore. He just placed it down like part of a ritual, as if habit was the last altar where we kept those whose memory had begun to fade. Noon passed slow. Sunlight poured down from the rafters to the floor like overripe honey, but it wasn't sweet. It made everything brittle, from the skin on his hands to the cracked wooden door. Elias walked out back, checked the patch of ground that used to be cornrows. Even weeds refused to grow. His old boot prints still held firm. No rain had come to wash them away. He knelt beside the cracked soil, lifted the first handful, and for the first time in months felt something stir, not in the dirt, but in himself. A weariness no longer content to sleep. He bowed his head, fingers still clutching the dust, and whispered words that didn't form fully. Maybe an apology, maybe a name, maybe just breath. But the earth heard, and from beneath a single ant crawled out. Its answer. Back on the porch he sat in the wooden chair by the door. Next to him a rifle, emptied long ago. Beneath the same boots he hadn't polished once since Sarah died. A squirrel scurried past, paused, looked at him. It wasn't afraid, only watched him quietly, as if it knew this man no longer wished to shoot at anything living. Evening began to settle. Light leaned into the walls. Everything inside cast long shadows, longer than truth, like Elias's past. He lifted the second cup, carried it out to the porch, and set it on the step. No one sat beside him. But today he didn't want that cup left forgotten indoors. The well was dry, the soil cracked, but he could still offer a seat, even if only to a ghost. Above, a cluster of clouds gathered, thin, gray, uncertain if they carried rain or were just another shadow. Elias looked up. His eyes held no hope, no despair. Only one thing remained: readiness. Elias had never been one for talking. What he held on to out here wasn't made of wood or iron, but of habit. Habits were like worn tracks in dirt. At first just a footprint, then a path. Then something that held you in place long after you meant to leave. The nearest town was 6 hours by horse. Mrs. Weathers' general store always opened late and closed early. She sold only what didn't spoil quick: salt, beans, coffee, gun oil, dry rice. Elias made the ride once a month. No one used his name anymore. They just called him that old man from Boone Valley. No one knew he'd rebuilt the fire tower on the North Ridge in '74. No one remembered it was his hands that kept Sarah alive through yellow fever in '81, mixing herbs, boiling porridge, playing her to sleep on a battered guitar. Sarah was gone now, and the guitar had been broken the day his son left. In the corner of the house, the ammo rack still hung on the wall. A leather cartridge belt, dusted with soot and age. He hadn't fired a single round in over a year. He didn't hunt anymore, didn't need to, didn't want to. The rifle was part of the wall now, like a coat hook, like a shadow, unused, but not thrown out, because throwing it out meant admitting he no longer had a reason to need it. Once a stranger came riding through, asked for water. Elias didn't say a word, just handed it to him. The stranger drank, nodded, and said, "Living out here alone, you must have a lot of faith." Elias didn't answer. After the man rode on, he stepped inside and opened the drawer where he kept the things he never talked about. Sarah's letters, the dagger his son had left behind. Inside was a white silk handkerchief, embroidered with a single droplet. Sarah had worn it the first day they met, at the church social. Elias pressed it to his cheek. Didn't cry. Just wanted to feel whether his skin could still recognize something soft. He lived as if he needed nothing, but truth was, He was guarding a small world that hadn't shattered yet. In one corner of the yard, an old clay pot sat, never held flowers, but every summer he sprinkled some ashes into it from the hearth. Sarah used to say, anything that's ever held warmth, if you put it back in the ground, might grow something gentle again. Nothing had ever grown there, but Elias kept scattering the ash anyway. That evening, the wind shifted. From the east, a thin whiff of smoke reached him from some forest he couldn't name. Elias sat on the porch, hand resting on the second cup. He didn't drink from it, just touched it. The way someone might touch the lid of an old chest they weren't ready to open. Beneath the step, a smear of mud appeared, thin and new. It wasn't from his boots, nor from the neighbor's dog who wandered by now and then. The trail led from the grass by the fence toward the abandoned horse barn. Elias stared at that line of mud for a long time. Didn't move, didn't speak. Only felt his chest grow heavy, like the hush before a storm that didn't come from the sky, but from deep within the earth. Midnight, no moon, no wind, only the slow creak of wood expanding in the cold, like old bones shifting after a long day. Elias woke in the dark, not from nightmares, but from smoke. He couldn't tell where it came from, but it smelled exactly like what had sunk into his hair that year. Flesh, ash, burnt leather, and the back of a shirt smoldering under night sky. Oklahoma, 1868. The settlement was surrounded. What they called a cleansing campaign. He was just a quiet soldier posted at the forest's edge carrying orders. Burn if they don't submit. Elias didn't light the match, but he didn't stop anyone either. Didn't shout, didn't step forward, didn't pull the trigger. Just stood there, the way he now sat, watching the fire hiss in the hearth. The next morning, among the ash, a doll, half burnt, lay by his boot. He didn't dare pick it up, and never told anyone, not even Sarah. Elias sat up, walked out to the porch. The moon had risen, split in two behind a thin veil of cloud. The wind came from the northeast, from lands he hadn't dared return to since that campaign. He sat on the steps, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed. From his shirt pocket, he pulled a piece of old hide, faded brown, edges torn. What lay inside, no one knew. Not even Elias. Not anymore. He hadn't opened it again. Last time he saw it, a native boy had run through the flames, left the bundle by a creek, then vanished into the trees forever. He once thought, I'll return this to his parents. But never found them, and later didn't try. Not out of fear, but shame, because he couldn't find a way to make something right after everything had already gone wrong. The smoke in tonight's wind wasn't thick, but thick enough to bring back the scent he'd spent years trying to bury. The smell of burned hair, of questions no one dared ask, of faith melting in fire. He stepped toward the well, stared into the black hole. Nothing looked back. Nothing replied. Only his own face, fractured by the dark. He remembered what Sarah had said on the last night. Her mind was still clear. I'm not afraid of dying, Elias. I'm afraid you'll be left with no one to forgive. In the dark, he placed a hand on the rim of the well. His fingers were dry, bony, leathered, but they trembled, not from cold, but because some part of him was still the soldier who had watched the fire and done nothing. In that moment, Elias felt rage, not at anyone else, but at himself for not having turned that old anger into anything but silence. And when he turned to go back inside, his eyes were wet, but not from crying. Something within him was melting, something he couldn't stop, and he knew. If tomorrow brought something out of the past, he wouldn't just stand there anymore. The next morning arrived as quiet as all the rest. No rooster crowed. No dew clung to the grass. Only a pale light, thin as ash, draped the rooftop, the porch beam, the shoulders of Elias Boone like a whispered reminder. The night has passed, but the old things remain. He walked toward the horse barn, carrying an empty pail, not to fill it, but because his hands needed something to hold, so they wouldn't tremble. Beyond the broken fence, he halted. There, on the dusty ground among dead grass, it's a trail of blood. The dirt beneath it darkened, as if bruised by something that didn't belong to this place. The blood trailed along the wire, then disappeared behind the sagebrush. Elias stood still, pail in hand, feet rooted. In that breathless second, the past thundered back like the sound of hooves from too far to stop. Figures running from flame, screams swallowed by wind, a charred doll lying alone in the forest. The blood trail wasn't large. It didn't gush. It seeped, like a wound that had been clenched tight through the night. But to Elias, it looked exactly like a question that no one had ever dared answer. He stepped closer, knelt, touched the soil with a calloused finger. Dry, but the iron smell still lingered, fresh, maybe from the night, maybe from just before dawn. He had seen blood all his life, too much of it, so much that he no longer believed it ever meant anything except an ending. But this blood, it opened a door long sealed shut. Behind it were faces, those he had turned away from, those he hadn't protected, those he never got the chance to say sorry to. He stood there a long time, as if standing long enough might make the earth speak. Who bled here? Why here? And most of all, was he once again standing too close to a mistake waiting to happen? He turned back toward the house. On the way, his eyes swept the fence line, and he saw it, a torn scrap of fabric caught on the wire. Dark brown, thick weave, not something a passing traveler would wear, and not his. Elias pulled it free, turned it over in his hand. Software stained with blood, and it smelled faintly of smoke. That noon, he didn't eat. He poured 2 glasses of water, same as always. But for the first time, he laid his hand on the second glass, and left it there longer than he ever had. He didn't lift it, just rested his hand, as if apologizing to someone no longer there, for things that hadn't yet happened, and things he wasn't sure he'd have the strength to face when they did. Outside, the wind had shifted, no longer from the east, but from the southwest, where the sky was thickening with dark, bruised clouds. The wind carried with it a sound that might have been footsteps or a shadow. Elias didn't rise. He simply pulled an old cloth from the drawer, wiped the second glass clean, and set it out on the porch. He said nothing, just left it there, an empty seat for whatever was coming, even if he didn't yet know whether he'd forgive it or fall to it all over again. By late afternoon, the clouds dragged across the ridge, casting the valley in the dull gray of rusted steel, a color Elias always believed belonged to things that couldn't be made whole again. There was no rain, only a shifting wind and a fading light, like memory rubbed thin by too many years. Elias stepped out to tie the rope at the cattle pen and saw it, the blood trail again, longer now. It curved along the eastern fence, where a few thorn bushes had grown taller than a man's knee. A wounded animal, he thought at first, but then, he heard it. Breath, faint, quick, the kind of breathing that no longer had the strength to call out its own name. He stepped forward slowly, fingers brushing the hilt of the knife at his side, not out of fear, but from old instincts. A life spent surviving on caution, not trust. Behind the sagebrush, in a dip in the earth carved by an old, forgotten rain, lay a body, small, curled, motionless, dark skin, long black hair matted with blood and grit. A boy, barely past 15, maybe not yet 20. His cloak was patched with rough twine, his shoes made of worn animal hide. Elias didn't call out. He simply stood there. His eyes rested on the boy's hand, still clinging to something wrapped in leather. The boy was alive. His chest rose. then fell, shallow, uneven. His lips were cracked, his mouth dry and bluish. On his left shoulder, a deep gash, blackened with dried blood. No one else had come with him, no hoofprints, no drag marks, no other hands, just a single child. Fleeing, wounded, and nearly surrendered, Elias knelt beside him. His old joints groaned, the sound of knees that hadn't bent for years, but he didn't flinch. He looked at the boy the way a man might look at himself in a broken mirror, blurry, aching, painful, but true, down to the last worn edge. No words passed between them. Only a flicker of eyes, barely open, full of confusion, exhaustion, and something that sounded like, "Please, don't let this be the final blow." Elias stood, turned away, took one step, then stopped. His fingers curled, as if to grasp something, but his hand held nothing. In his head, Sarah's voice, soft like a mosquito buzzing near his ear on a summer night. Not every child gets to choose where they fall. He turned back, walked to the boy, didn't draw the knife, didn't ask a name, didn't check the wound. He simply knelt, slid an arm gently behind the boy's neck, so careful as if afraid to press against a fracture he couldn't see. The boy didn't resist, didn't open his eyes, didn't speak. He just breathed. A single breath, the kind that said, for a moment the world had stopped being an enemy. Elias lifted him, light, fragile, like carrying a half-rotted limb of firewood. No one saw. No one knew what he was doing. Not even Elias. Only the wind blew back toward the wooden house, carrying the scent of blood, of soil, and of something older than memory itself. Faith, still alive, barely, and asking to be remembered. Elias pushed open the barn door with his shoulder. The hinges rusted, his arms too burdened to carry both himself and the boy with ease. Inside, the light slanted through cracked boards, dust hanging like old breath in the stillness. He laid the boy in a pile of dry hay, the same stall where he once kept a wild horse he never did break. That horse had died the year before. And Elias hadn't changed the hay, because there'd been nothing worth keeping it clean for, until now. The boy was unconscious, still gripping the leather-wrapped bundle tight to his chest. Elias didn't pry it free, didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled an old washcloth from his shirt pocket, wet it with the last of the rainwater he'd saved, and wiped the mud from the boy's face. Not for cleanliness, not for health, but because in that moment he saw his own son again. The day he came back from the woods, sweat-soaked, hair wild, eyes feral, and Elias caught between love and fury, between holding on and pushing away. The boy's shoulder bore a long gash. The blood had dried into a crusted mass. Elias tore a strip from his own shirt, sprinkled it with salt, and wrapped it in place using a worn saddle strap. The boy let out a low sound, more breath than voice. He didn't open his eyes, didn't call for his mother, didn't ask for water. Elias watched him, didn't blink, didn't speak. Then he stood, walked to the back of the barn where an old rifle hung on a hook. He took it down and buried it deep in the hay. Not to use it, but so he wouldn't reach for it if fear came rushing back too fast. He returned to the boy, poured a cup of water, the second cup, the one he usually left on the table each morning, untouched. He brought it into the barn, placed it near the boy's hand, but didn't press it to his lips. Then he sat down, leaned against the wooden wall, and breathed. Not tired, just full. Wind slipped through a crack in the roof, lifting dust in soft spirals. A single fly circled the wound's edge. Elias waved it away, not sharply, but like he once used to calm a restless cow in its final days. Dusk came down slow. The sun broke apart in pieces of orange and red, casting light across the boy's fevered face. Elias laid his hand on the boy's forehead, hot as fire. the fire of blood, the fire of the forest that once burned, the fire of something inside him not yet burned out. Hours passed before Elias rose again and went inside. He left the boy lying there, tended, held, but never asked to respond. At the stove, Elias did something strange. He filled 2 cups with water again, but not one for himself and one for Sarah. The second cup, this time, was for someone living, someone breathing, someone who hadn't spoken. His name. Dinner was cold cornbread and salted beans. Elias ate little, set some aside, carried the plate back to the barn, left it by the boy. No words, no waiting for thanks, just left it the way someone long ago had once left something for him, when he was half alive in a forest no one had named. Outside, the wind shifted again. From the mountains came a sound, not a wolf, not rain, but something deeper, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't live alone much longer. That night, in the small house on the prairie, Elias did not turn off the lamp before bed, because someone, not him, was still breathing in the old horse stall, and they might need to see light when they opened their eyes. The night passed like a thin thread stretched between 2 sharp points, past and present. The wind had eased. There was no rain, but the cold seeped through every crack in the walls, as if it came not to chill the bones, but to interrogate whatever hope still dared survive in this barren land. Elias didn't sleep. He lay on the cushioned chair by the stove, a thin blanket draped across his stomach, eyes open, watching the shadowed outline of the door. Every time the wind tugged the latch and the wood creaked, his thoughts returned to the boy in the barn, a boy whose name he didn't know, whose reasons he hadn't asked, who had collapsed right on the edge of his land. There was no need for a reason. All that mattered was the boy was still breathing. At first light, Elias rekindled the fire, brewed weak coffee, cut a stale piece of cornbread from the day before. When he stepped out the back door, the morning mist still clung to his shoulders. In the barn, the boy was awake, not sitting, not speaking, just lying on his side, eyes open, staring up at the broken roof slats. That gaze didn't plead, didn't defend. It was the look of a wounded animal, quiet, observant, ready to flee or die if the hand moved wrong. Elias said nothing. He placed the cup of coffee and the slice of bread beside the hay, then stepped back 3 paces, still facing the boy, but not moving closer. The space between them hung thick with dust, but something inside that dust had begun to settle. The boy blinked once, then slowly lifted his hand, not to reach for the food, but to rest it over his side, where the leather-wrapped object still lay. That hand trembled, but never let go, like someone clutching the last piece of truth they had left, afraid that if it slipped away, they'd vanish with it. Elias watched, then sat by the barn door, not guarding, not quite keeping company either, just being there, close enough not to abandon, far enough not to trespass, the kind of presence a wounded person might quietly appreciate but never admit to. The sun climbed. Light slipped through the wall slats, touching the dried blood on the boy's shoulder. Elias took a clean cloth, dampened it with water, moved forward, then paused. The boy had turned his head slightly, eyes following the motion of Elias's hand. He said nothing, only breathed a little heavier. No permission, no protest, just a silence that was now being shared. Elias wiped the blood away, then rinsed the wound with diluted whiskey. The boy clenched his jaw, but his face stayed still, as if pain had been a daily ritual longer than his years should have allowed. Elias wrapped it again, this time more carefully, more gently. Then he buried the bottle of whiskey in the hay, beside the rifle he had hidden the day before. No words were spoken, but in that silence, a pact had begun to form. This man would not ask. This boy would not run. Not yet. Leaving the barn, Elias sat on the porch step, The sun had risen to the ridge. He filled the second cup with water, carried it to the barn door, and left it by the frame. He didn't wait for the boy to take it, didn't look for thanks, just left it. Like someone placing a quiet trust near a wound that hadn't yet closed. That afternoon, Elias wrote a few lines in the old leather notebook, the one Sarah used to tally cattle prices, planting seasons, and things no one counted anymore. He wrote, "This one's not like the others. Didn't ask for food, didn't ask for mercy, but he breathes like life is a debt, not a gift." The wind began to shift. From the west now, a scent unfamiliar, the smell of turned earth, of old gunpowder, of something Elias had known once and now felt circling back. By late afternoon, the sun dipped behind the western ridge, leaving a trail of burned copper stretching across the horizon. Wind dragged dust across the barn roof, like the smoke-stained memories of Elias, blurry, bitter, never quite gone. He stepped quietly into the stall, carrying a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. The dark-skinned boy still lay on his side, perhaps asleep, perhaps pretending. His shoulder was less swollen, but his breathing was still heavy, the kind of breath carried by someone dragging a debt that hadn't yet been paid. Elias's eyes caught the edge of a leather tube jutting from beneath the boy's belt, tied with worn rope, carefully bound, its edges smoothed as if touched 100 times. Etched faintly on its surface, a single inscription, barely visible after the years, "For the day of return." Elias squinted, his heart tensed. Those words, they reminded him of the sacred objects once carried by the Comanche, a people driven from Oklahoma after the war, when Union patrols tightened their grip on the frontier, clearing space for settlers to flood in. He knelt, set the bowl of water beside the boy's hand, then sat across from him in the hay. The day's last light filtered through the wall slats, illuminating the leather tube in full. Elias felt the urge to reach for it, to know what it held, a map, a letter, some relic from a village that burned during the 1868 raids. The soldier in him, the one who had survived firelit nights in enemy woods, wanted to be sure, to rule out danger, but his hand pulled back. Elias exhaled slowly, eyes resting on the boy. He remembered 1870 when he found a torn Comanche flag hanging in the charred forest near Red River. No one survived. Only a spear planted in the dirt and a piece of cloth sewn with flame, symbol of those who neither ran nor surrendered. Back then, Elias had wondered, why hold on to fabric all the way to death? Now, staring at the tube, he understood. Some things weren't meant to be understood. They only needed to be kept, because to keep them was to keep yourself. The boy stirred. His eyes cracked open, less wild now, but still wary, and Elias recognized those eyes. They were the same his son had the day he left to live among the Kiowa, believing that this land didn't belong to the man with the rifle. This boy, maybe he'd run from a patrol. Maybe he was hunted, as so many were after the uprisings on the plains. Maybe that leather tube was the last thread tying him to a village that no longer stood. Elias didn't ask. He just changed the bandage, cleaned the wound again with diluted whiskey, his touch as light as if the skin beneath were made of glass. The boy winced, bit his lip, but never made a sound, as if pain was a language he no longer needed help translating. When Elias wrapped the shoulder again, the boy shifted slightly, pulling the leather tube closer to his chest. Their eyes met, not fully trusting but no longer wanting to run. Elias gave a small nod. The boy didn't respond, but his fingers loosened their grip just a little, enough to know that trust, however small, had begun. Elias stepped outside. He glanced toward the eastern fence, where the blood trail had started. Moonlight had risen, silver spread across the dead grass. Near the fence, half hidden beneath the brush, he spotted another piece of leather. He didn't touch it, not yet, but he remembered where it lay, because the boy hadn't strayed far from it. And that meant Elias was now inside a story far bigger than a wounded child. Before going back inside, he filled the second cup with water, left a piece of cornbread beside it. Not out of debt, not out of pity, but because doing what's right sometimes needs no understanding. The night air turned cold. The oil lamp in the house flickered in the breeze, its glow smudged and soft. But Elias let it burn, bright enough that if the boy opened his eyes, he'd know someone was still awake. 3 horses rode slow from the far end of High Hollow Valley, red dust curling around their iron hooves, a wordless warning carried by wind and grit. Elias saw them long before they saw the weathered roof of his cabin. He stood still on the porch, adjusted his coat, his hands empty, his eyes locked on the shapes of 3 soldiers in faded uniforms, gun belts glinting under the low evening sun. The lead rider dismounted, tall, face sharp as a drawn blade. He stepped forward. "You see a young Indian boy pass through here. 16, 17, wounded, carrying a long leather tube. Could be a map or tribal papers." His voice was clipped, cold, the sound of a post-war officer used to patrolling scorched ground, hunting the last of the tribes left behind after the broken treaties of 1868. Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the man's shadow, bent and crooked against the earth like a memory refusing to let go. "Haven't seen anyone," he said. His voice was rough as whetstone. He turned back into the house, brought out the coffee pot, poured 2 brown-glazed mugs, one for himself, one for the uninvited. He placed the second mug on the table. No words, no gesture to offer it. The youngest soldier, face freckled, circled around the house, stopping. Near the barn, Elias felt a weight tighten in his chest. The boy was in there, still breathing, clutching the leather tube, his life flickering like a wick too close to burnt. Elias remembered the old patrols, how they burned villages to silence uprisings. This boy might be the son of someone who stood beneath that same smoke. The officer squinted at the steaming cup, at the half-eaten cornbread on the table. "You live alone. Who drinks this one?" He stepped forward, hand resting on his holster. Elias didn't flinch. He lifted his cup, took a slow sip. "I've lived a long time. No one stops by. If they did, I'd remember." The officer moved in, voice dropping low, dark and tight. "He's carrying something important. A map stolen from a military outpost. If you're hiding him, you'll pay. This ain't a matter for old men." Elias stared straight into him. Didn't blink. "I've got nothing to hide." The freckled soldier came back from the barn, eyes wary. "There's blood by the fence, sir." Elias felt his heartbeat clench, but his face stayed still. He stepped to the door, pointed toward the field. "Fox, they wander close around here." The officer spat in the dirt, eyes sharp as broken glass. "If you're lying, we'll be back, and we won't just ask questions." They rode off, hooves branding the ground like scars. Elias stood frozen on the porch, his hand clamped around the coffee cup, gone cold. When the last rider disappeared behind the ridge, he stepped inside, washed the second cup, put it back in its place. Then he walked to the barn, carrying a cloth soaked in healing oil and a small bone-handled knife. The boy was awake, eyes open, still holding the leather tube tight. Elias placed the cloth beneath his head, set the knife beside him. "If you need to go, go. If you want to stay, don't be afraid." No words, just Elias's hand, resting for a second on the boy's head, then pulling back, as if the touch had never happened at all. Dawn broke with a pale, colorless light. the kind of light that only touches land that has seen too much fire. Wind came down from the ridge, soft as a whisper between two people with nothing left to say. Elias opened the back of the barn. No warning, no gesture, just a door left unlocked, facing east. The native boy had been fully awake since midnight. He didn't run. He just sat there, arms wrapped around the leather tube, as if it were the last part of him still breathing. The wound near his ribs had stopped bleeding, but his eyes still carried the shadow of something hunted, not by men, but by memory. Elias placed beside him a piece of cornbread and a small cloth sack of salve, then turned away, asked no name, wanted no thanks. When the sunlight touched the stretch of red soil by the broken fence, the boy left. He didn't run. He walked, slow but certain. Before leaving the view of the weathered house, he paused. His footsteps pressed deep into the dry, cracked earth, right next to the place Elias always left the second cup. The boy opened the leather tube, pulled out a thin piece of wood, carved with a rough knife. Carefully he set it on the table, near the cup that still held warmth from the morning. On the face of the wood, with lines shaky but deliberate, was the image of a hand reaching toward water, and beneath it, a single line etched like a scar. He who gives water to the wounded deserves more remembrance than he who draws the gun. No name, no return address, just one sentence, as if written by Elias himself, 10 years ago, with hands that had not yet stopped trembling. The back door remained open. Sunlight swept across the floor, caught the old photograph of Elias and Sarah. Wind moved through the frame, carrying the scent of grass, of sand, and something stranger, the scent of release. When Elias returned from the cattle shed, he saw the piece of wood. He saw the cup, for the first time in 10 years, with the faint trace of lips newly placed, and a few drops of water resting in the bottom. He sat down, didn't smile, didn't cry. He just sat, as if listening to a very old song, very familiar, that no one plays anymore. As dusk fell, he lit the stove, made coffee again, poured 2 cups like he always had, only this time he didn't leave the second on the table. He carried it outside, set it gently on the porch step, where morning mist sometimes lingered, where a man might see someone coming back, or someone already gone. A breeze moved across the trees on the far hill, and somewhere in the silver ash of the clouds above, a single drop of water fell, slow, small, but enough to wet the rim of the clay cup. The rains, never promised, had come. A week passed like a dried-up stream, leaving no mark, no voice, only wind drifting across the wooden roof as if searching for an answer. No one dared to speak aloud. Elias woke earlier than usual, not because he was busy, not because his sleep had grown shorter, only because he felt the need to do something, though he didn't yet know what. He checked the fox traps, tidied the grain shed, rearranged the stones around the hearth. His hands still trembled whenever he lifted something heavy, but now that tremble didn't only come from age. It came from something else, growing in the silence, something he didn't dare name yet. Hope. When he reached the well behind the house, the one that had run dry like memories unwashed, Elias stopped. Beneath the flat stone where he used to sit during hot summer noons, something waited, a thin slab of rock, smooth on one side, rough beneath, as if worn down by hands that had traveled far and hard. He sat, opened it with the same hands that once held rifles, but now only knew the weight of a hoe. Inside, carved with careworn strokes, was the image of a hand cupping a falling droplet of rain from the sky, and below it another line, still shaky, still rough, but unmistakably human. He who holds water for the hunted also holds the last right thing left in this land. No signature, no date, no talk of war, no mention of debt or vengeance. Just a sentence. Clean. Like an old engraving on a rifle stock long polished and now hung, unused, on the wall. Elias gave a small nod, didn't speak, but he understood. Not because he needed thanks, but because after 10 years of living with nameless ghosts, he had finally seen himself through the eyes of someone he had once saved, and through the gaze of a past he had long tried to outrun. No knock on the door. No one needed to come. He simply placed the stone beside the fireplace, where Sarah used to sit in the evenings. Then he poured water. Set out 2 cups, one on the table and one by the window, where morning light streamed in through golden dust falling like slow ash. No music played, no warm voice returned, only silence. But this time it wasn't the enemy. That morning the sky hung lower than it had in years. No wind, only a thin layer of mist like an old cloth shaken loose and draped across the valley. Elkhorn remained quiet, as it had for years now, but today it was no longer alone, just less crowded. Elias lit the fire early, not from cold, but because his hands were used to the rhythm. Same old motions. Strike the flint, stir the kindling, lift the kettle scrubbed clean with ash. Pour hot water into 2 brown-glazed cups, one large, one small. The large cup he placed on the table, beside the chair he always sat in. The small one he carried out to the porch, set it down on the weathered step worn smooth by boots long gone. No one was coming, no one was expected, but the cup no longer stood alone. It waited there like a quiet greeting for someone who had once arrived and might one day return. In the barn the old cow snorted, as if suspicious of the sky. On the roof a single drop landed with a hush, then another. Elias didn't look up. He simply closed his eyes. Listened to the water fall like someone tapping gently on the cheek of time. The scent of damp earth rose from the porch. Not strong, not urgent, as if even the rain didn't want to interrupt anything. Elias opened the door, stepped out, stood there, as the mist swept lightly across his face, still holding the cup of untouched water. The first rain in many months had come. Not fierce, just the sky's way of whispering, "I remember you." Under the eaves the small cup remained full. Raindrops clung to its rim, glistening like the eyes of a wounded child who no longer needed to be afraid. No one knew how long Elias stood there. No one marked the hour the rain began. Only he did. And the sound of wood expanding softly in the wet, like a heart being called home by a language that needed no words. The second cup, after 10 long years, was no longer held for someone who wouldn't return. It was for someone who had been here and never truly left.